Okay, so picture this. About 5,500 years ago, right in a lush river valley in modern day Iraq, humans did something totally unprecedented. They built a city. And I don't mean just a slightly bigger village. We're talking about the emergence of a pristine civilization. What's absolutely mind blowing about this, and it's basically a planetary locked room mystery, is that this would independently happen only a handful of times in all of human history. So, why did we suddenly stop wandering around in small, scattered bands and start building massive, structured urban centers? And honestly, more importantly, why was it so incredibly rare? Let's dive right into this explainer and figure it out. I mean, really think about it for a second. We humans possess the exact same brains, the exact same intellect, and identical biological capabilities everywhere on the planet, right? We managed to populate practically every corner of the Earth. But we only organically built pristine civilizations in 6 completely isolated pockets. That's it, just 6. It definitely wasn't some natural, inevitable next step for humanity. It was an absolute, glaring anomaly. And over a span of about 4,000 years, civilization just kind of popped up in these 6 distinct spots. We've got Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Andes, the Indus Valley, China, and Mesoamerica. But here's the craziest part. There was absolutely zero contact between them. None. No shared knowledge, obviously no internet, no cross-continental trade of architectural blueprints or political systems. Every single one of these societies figured out the wildly complex puzzle of city building completely on their own, right from scratch. To really wrap our heads around how weird this is, we have to look at the sheer scale of time involved here. We had roughly 200,000 years of anatomically modern human history leading up to this moment without a single city anywhere on Earth. That's 200 millennia of hunting, gathering, and, eventual early farming. But absolutely no megastructures, no complex state hierarchies, no sprawling metropolises. It really makes you wonder, right? What exactly had to line up to break a 200,000-year streak? What on earth was the catalyst that finally forced our ancestors to change their entire way of living? Well, anthropologists actually have a term for this. It's called pristine state formation. Now, we aren't talking about cities that were built just because some neighboring empire swooped in, conquered a territory, and set up an administration. No. We're looking strictly at societies that were the absolute first to do it in their given hemisphere, driven 100% by local internal pressures, totally uninfluenced, completely independent, and entirely unprecedented. So if we pull up V. Gordon Child's classic 1950 Urban Revolution checklist, it tells us exactly what counts as a civilization. And the defining characteristic of these very first cities wasn't just that people were living clumped together. It actually required a massive agricultural surplus. You needed enough extra food to feed full-time specialists, soldiers, priests, artisans. Society had to fundamentally shift from just basic day-to-day survival to being deeply specialized, highly stratified, and totally driven by that surplus. But actually, let's just bust a massive myth right now. Relying on insights from anthropologists like David Graeber and David Wengrow, we know that you absolutely do not need a king to have a civilization. We've all been taught to imagine that early cities were instantly ruled by these despots with absolute iron-fisted power, but the archaeological record tells a totally different story. Early Mesopotamian settlements and even massive sprawling cities like Teotihuacan in Mesoamerica for a time show evidence of highly egalitarian structures. The birth of a pristine state doesn't necessarily mean you instantly crown a monarch. It really just means you have a permanent, complexly organized society. So how did they pull it off? Scholars generally point to 3 specific pressures that had to perfectly align to break that massive 200,000-year streak. Think of these as the absolute required ingredients: domesticable species, circumscribed geography, and coordination problems. If you miss even one of these ingredients, a pristine city simply never takes root. It's like baking a cake. Leave out the flour, and you've just got a mess. The first ingredient is purely biological luck. As scholar Jared Diamond famously pointed out, having the right starter kit was just geographical happenstance. Take the Fertile Crescent in the Middle East, for example. It naturally hit the jackpot with a ridiculously rich array of calorie-dense plants like wild wheat and barley, plus incredibly compliant, easy-to-domesticate animals like cattle, sheep, and pigs. Now contrast that with the Americas. Sure, they had maize, but early maize was tiny. It literally required centuries of selective breeding just to become useful. And to make matters tougher, the Americas lacked large draft animals entirely. No horses, no beasts of burden to pull plows. That means all that massive agricultural surplus had to be generated by sheer human muscle. This incredibly uneven biological lottery drastically altered the speed and path of early urban development. Moving on to the second clue, we have Robert Carnero's brilliant circumscription theory. And this kind of flips everything we assume about human cooperation right on its head. Civilization didn't start because people cheerfully decided they wanted to team up. It started because they were trapped. Look at it this way. In an open landscape, if two farming villages get into a fight, the losers can just pack up, walk over the next hill, and start over. No big deal. But if you're geographically boxed in by unforgiving deserts, towering mountains, or vast oceans, you literally have nowhere to run. When conflict happens, losers can't flee. They get absorbed, they get conquered, and they get taxed. That intense, inescapable pressure cooker, that's what creates a state. And that brings us to our final ingredient, coordination. Carl Wittfogel's hydraulic hypothesis is a perfect illustration of this. Imagine you live in a river valley that requires massive, interconnected canal networks just to grow enough food. That is a logistical nightmare. Dozens of separate villages can't manage violent floodwaters and allocate scarce resources independently. It'd be total chaos. You absolutely need a centralized authority to organize the labor and enforce the rules. And eventually, those water managers calcify into a permanent ruling class. The physical infrastructure practically demands a political infrastructure. Now, when we lay out these 6 pristine cases side by side, a really glaring pattern falls right out. Every single one of these unique civilizations was boxed in by hostile terrain. Mesopotamia's river valley was flanked by harsh desert. Egypt had extreme desert borders on both sides. The Andes featured the super narrow coastal strip that was just squeezed against impossible mountains. And despite massive cultural differences, like, the Indus Valley showing zero clear evidence of kings, or early Indian societies completely lacking writing and pottery at first, every single group was forced to adapt to their geographic cage. They couldn't run, so they built up. So, this begs the obvious question that I'm absolutely sure you're asking right now. If the human brain is the exact same everywhere, why didn't places like Europe, Sub-Saharan Africa, or Australia make the list? Why didn't they spontaneously generate their own pristine states from scratch? To answer that, we really need to understand the difference between the two paths to building a state. Pristine states, like we've been talking about, were born entirely independently out of that incredibly rare convergence of geographic traps and environmental pressures. Secondary states, on the other hand, formed through contact, trade, or conquest by an already existing state. Now, it is absolutely vital to keep in mind that secondary states are just as culturally rich, powerful, and sophisticated as pristine states. They just have a different origin story. They didn't have to invent the concept of a city from thin air. The idea or the pressure to adapt to it was introduced to them. Let's do a quick global rollout. In Europe, the geography was highly fragmented by mountains, sure, but the borders were open enough that people could just walk away from conflict. Populations dispersed rather than consolidated. True states arrived there later via contact with the Mediterranean and the Middle East. Over in Sub-Saharan Africa, you had these incredible massive empires like Mali and Great Zimbabwe thriving, but they largely formed after deep contact with existing intercontinental trade networks. And in Australia, it's a bit of a tragic combo. A lack of domesticable local species, combined with severe climate variability, meant that the massive agricultural surplus required to kickstart the whole urban revolution simply never gained a foothold. Which brings us to the absolute most fascinating realization of this entire explainer. The uncomfortable core of the data suggests that the birth of civilization wasn't necessarily some glorious, deliberate human triumph. Our ancestors didn't just wake up one sunny morning and joyfully decide to invent taxes, class hierarchies, and grueling manual labor. Obviously not. Instead, civilization was a reluctant response to hitting a brick wall. It was literally the only viable survival strategy left when populations were trapped agriculturally, politically, and geographically. It totally forces us to reconsider our own history. The thing we call the birth of civilization might not be a triumph of human ingenuity, so much as a response to being trapped, with nowhere left to go but up or under someone else's rule. Humans only sacrificed their ancient freedoms and built these massive, incredibly demanding hierarchies when they literally had no other option. They were boxed into a corner by Mother Nature, forced to either organize together under a centralized system or submit to a conquering neighbor. Which leaves us with this final, incredibly provocative thought to chew on today. If the very foundation of our modern world, our cities, our states, our entire organized way of life, was essentially an accidental byproduct of ancient people being boxed in by deserts, mountains, and oceans, what does that say about us? If civilization required such incredibly rare, specific, and reluctant pressures to even exist in the first place, just how fragile is the global society we live in right now? Take a moment to really think about that the next time you look at a city skyline. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer.